The call came in at 2:13 a.m. No screaming, no panic, not even background noise. Just silence. The 911 operator, a woman named Dana, who had worked the night shift for 6 years, later said she'd heard thousands of emergency calls. Hysterical mothers, car crashes, gunshots still echoing into the receiver. But she had never heard anything quite like this. For 11 full seconds, the line was open, and all she could make out was breathing, slow, controlled, deliberate, and then a voice, quiet, almost too calm. I think there's been a death. Not someone is dying, not I need help. I think there's been a death. What police discovered inside that house would trigger a psychological investigation so disturbing that even seasoned detectives admitted they had no framework for what they were seeing. Because by the time officers arrived at the scene, the body had already been there for days. And the person who made that call had been living in the house the entire time. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than you think. Millbrook Lane, if you've never heard of it, that's exactly the point. It's the kind of street that exists in the background of every town. Rows of similar houses, similar lawns, similar mailboxes, similar lives. The kind of street where neighbors wave but don't really know each other. Where curtains twitch but no one asks questions. The house at number 44 was a 2-story colonial. White-trimmed windows. A wooden porch swing that had stopped swinging years ago. A garden that had once clearly been tended with real care. Rosebush still bloomed against the fence line, almost defiantly, despite the rest of the yard being overgrown and forgotten. The neighbors would later describe the house the way people describe things they should have paid more attention to. Quiet, said the woman from across the street. Always quiet. I just thought he kept to himself, said the retired man 2 doors down. I didn't think there was anything wrong. I never heard anything, and that was precisely the problem. The man who lived at 44 Millbrook Lane, we'll call him Martin, because his legal case is still partially sealed at time of recording, was 41 years old, no prior criminal record, no history of violence, no restraining orders, no police callouts. By every administrative measure that exists, Martin was an ordinary person living an ordinary life, but the reality inside that house was anything but ordinary. Now, before I go any further, if you enjoy real, in-depth crime stories told like this, consider subscribing. We go deep on cases that don't get the coverage they deserve. Okay, let's get back to Millbrook Lane, because to understand what happened in that house, we need to understand who else was living there. Martin had lived at 44 Millbrook Lane for 11 years. He moved in with his mother, Eleanor, after his father passed away in 2012. Eleanor was 74 years old, a retired schoolteacher. By all accounts, sharp-minded, warm, and deeply private. Former students occasionally sent her Christmas cards. A neighbor remembered her bringing over homemade biscuits when they moved in. She was that kind of woman, they said. Martin was her only child. He had never married. He worked remotely, some kind of data processing role for a logistics company that he rarely discussed in detail. He ordered groceries online. He drove a gray sedan that sat in the driveway more often than it moved. He had what appeared to be a perfectly self-contained life. What's important to understand here, and this is something the psychologists who later reviewed this case kept coming back to, is that Martin and Eleanor's relationship was described by people who knew them as enmeshed. That's a clinical term. It means the boundaries between two people have collapsed. They aren't just close, they are, in a psychological sense, almost fused. Neighbors recalled seeing Martin do everything for his mother. Grocery runs. Doctor's appointments. He'd sit with her on the porch in the evenings. He cooked every meal. He managed her medication. In some ways, it was touching. In other ways, with the benefit of hindsight, it was a warning sign that nobody thought to read. Because when Eleanor became the center of Martin's entire world, what would happen to Martin when Eleanor was no longer in it? Hold that question. Because the answer is the most disturbing part of this entire story. It was a Tuesday in late October. Martin later told investigators, and this is documented in the case files, that he woke up around 6:30 a.m. and went downstairs to make breakfast. 2 cups of tea, toast with marmalade on one plate, plain on the other. The same routine they'd had for years. He called up to Eleanor. No answer. He climbed the stairs. He opened her bedroom door. And that is where the story fractures into something deeply, profoundly strange. Because what Martin did next, or more accurately, what he didn't do, is what would eventually define this entire case. He didn't call 999. He didn't call a doctor. He didn't knock on a neighbor's door. He didn't scream. He went back downstairs. He poured 1 cup of tea instead of 2. And he sat at the kitchen table for 7 days. Now, I want to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. Is this grief? Is this denial? Is this something more calculated? That's exactly the question that split the psychiatric team assigned to this case right down the middle. And I promise you, we're going to get into that in detail. But first, let's talk about what those 7 days actually looked like. Because it wasn't what you'd expect. Martin didn't barricade himself in the house. He didn't stop functioning. He continued his life in a way that investigators would later describe as one of the most psychologically complex grief responses they had ever documented. He ordered his groceries as normal. His internet activity logs, reviewed later, showed he watched television in the evenings. He sent emails to his employer. He responded to messages. He maintained his routine with almost robotic precision. Except Eleanor was upstairs, and he hadn't told anyone. Here's what I want you to think about as we go deeper into this. At what point does grief stop being grief and start being something else entirely? On day 3, Martin placed an online order for a room deodorizer. 12 units. The investigators noted this in their report, with a particular kind of clinical detachment that I think actually makes it more disturbing, not less. He knew. He was fully aware of what was happening in that upstairs room. And yet some wall inside his mind, prevented him from picking up the phone. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case, Dr. Sarah Okafor, described what she believed Martin was experiencing as a form of dissociative grief response. It's rare. It's not well understood. But in essence, the theory goes like this. For certain individuals whose entire identity is wrapped around another person, the death of that person doesn't register the way it does for most of us. The brain doesn't accept it. It doesn't process the finality. Instead, it builds a kind of psychological bridge, a temporary reality where the person is still functionally present, even when they're not. It's not delusion in the traditional sense. Martin knew his mother was dead. He could articulate it when finally interviewed. But acknowledging it to the outside world would mean it became real in a way his mind wasn't ready to survive. So he didn't. He kept the curtains drawn on Eleanor's room. He didn't go in. He continued making decisions about the house, about the finances, about his day, as though she were simply sleeping. On day 5, a letter arrived from Eleanor's GP surgery, a routine appointment reminder. Martin placed it on the kitchen counter, unopened. On day 6, Eleanor's friend from her church group, a woman named Patricia, sent a text asking if Eleanor was all right, as she'd missed their Thursday telephone call. Martin replied, "She's a bit under the weather. She'll be in touch when she's feeling better." And here's where I want to ask you something directly. If you were Patricia, a woman who'd known Eleanor for 20 years, would that message have worried you? Or would you have taken it at face value? Because Patricia did take it at face value. And nobody else checked. Not until day 7. Day 7 is when Martin made the call. If you enjoy cases like this, the kind that get under your skin and stay there, drop a like and share this with someone. It genuinely helps this channel continue making content at this level. Now, the call. 2:13 a.m. The exact time is significant for a reason investigators didn't immediately understand. Why 2:13? Why the middle of the night? Why not the morning, when it might feel more manageable? The profiler attached to the case later suggested that middle-of-the-night calls in cases like this often reflect a breaking point. A moment when the psychological architecture someone has been carefully maintaining simply cracks. When the darkness outside matches the darkness inside, and the wall finally gives way. Something gave way for Martin at 2:13 a.m. He picked up his phone, he dialed the emergency number. And then he sat there in silence for 11 seconds. Operator Dana Reyes described the silence as pressurized. She said, "I could tell someone was there. I could hear them breathing." But it wasn't panicked breathing. It was like someone working themselves up to say something they'd been holding in for a very long time. 11 seconds. Then, "I think there's been a death." Dana's training kicked in immediately. She asked for the address. Martin gave it clearly and calmly. She asked what had happened. Martin said, "My mother. She's upstairs. She's been there for some time. Not she just passed. Not I found her. Sometime." Dana flagged the call to her supervisor immediately. Something in her instincts, honed by 6 years on that line, told her this was not a standard welfare call. 2 patrol cars and a paramedic unit were dispatched. They arrived at 44 Millbrook Lane at 2:24 a.m. And what they found when Martin opened the front door was something none of them had been fully prepared for. He was dressed, fully, at 2 a.m., dark trousers, a clean shirt, hair combed. He looked, by the account of the first officer on scene, like someone waiting to be collected. He stepped aside without being asked. He pointed to the stairs. He said, "She's in her room. Second door on the left. I've kept the door closed." And then he sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Do you think Martin had been planning to make that call for days? Or was it truly a breaking point he didn't see coming? I'm going to be measured here because real people are involved in this story. But I want to give you the truth of what investigators documented because it's important for understanding everything that comes after. Eleanor's room was, by all accounts, undisturbed. That was the word repeated in every officer's report. Undisturbed. The bed was made. The curtains were drawn. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, placed there, investigators later determined, by Martin, sometime in those first days. As though she might still need it. Eleanor had passed from natural causes, cardiac arrest, consistent with her age and prior health conditions. The medical examiner confirmed there was no indication of foul play. None. This is critical to understand, because it fundamentally changes the nature of this case. Martin had not harmed his mother. He had simply been unable to let her go. The lead detective on scene, D. Robert Crane, gave a press statement several weeks later in which he said something that I think is worth sitting with. In 30 years of policing, I've attended hundreds of death scenes. This was one of very few where I left feeling less certain about human psychology than when I arrived. What unsettled D. Crane, what unsettled everyone involved, was the duality of what they were seeing. On one hand, Martin's behavior in those 7 days showed clear awareness, clear functionality, clear intelligence. He managed his life. He communicated with the outside world. He ordered supplies. He maintained his employment. On the other hand, he had been living in a house with his deceased mother for 7 days, had told no one, and had placed a glass of water on her nightstand. How do both of those things exist inside the same person, at the same time? That question, that specific uncomfortable question, became the center of everything that followed. Because when Martin was taken in for questioning, what he told investigators was not what anyone expected to hear. And I need you to stay with me for this next part. Because what Martin said in that interview room fundamentally reframes everything I've told you so far. Martin cooperated fully. That was the first thing D. Crane noted. No lawyer requested. No reluctance. He sat in the interview room, hands folded on the table, and answered every question with the same quiet, measured manner he'd used on the phone. D.I. Crane started gently. He asked Martin to describe the morning he'd found Eleanor. Martin described it without emotion. Not the absence of emotion that comes from numbness, but a different kind. Something more like resolution. As though he had already processed something privately that the rest of the world was only just catching up to. Then Crane asked the question that had been sitting in the room since they'd arrived at Millbrook Lane. Martin, why didn't you call for help sooner? And Martin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because calling would have made it final, as long as no one official knew. It was still just between me and her. It was still ours. The room was silent. Crane pushed gently. He asked Martin if he had spoken to Eleanor during those 7 days. Martin didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up and said, very quietly, not out loud. The forensic psychologist Dr. Okafor reviewed the interview recordings extensively. In her written assessment, she identified what she called one of the most articulate and self-aware descriptions of complicated grief I have encountered in a clinical context. Martin wasn't psychotic. He wasn't delusional. He didn't believe Eleanor was alive. He knew exactly what had happened. He had simply built a psychological fortress around the reality of it, a fortress that for 7 days held. Until 2:13 a.m., when it didn't. Here's the question I keep coming back to, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Is what Martin did a crime? He didn't harm anyone. There was no foul play. He simply failed to report a death in a timely manner. In most jurisdictions, and this was a significant legal debate in the aftermath of this case, the law around failure to report a death is surprisingly gray. But the legal dimension of this story is only half of what made it disturbing. Because what investigators discovered when they began looking more closely at Martin's background, his history, his medical records, his childhood, revealed something that reframed the entire narrative. Something that nobody had seen coming. When the investigation team requested Martin's medical history, standard procedure in a case like this, they expected what they usually found. Perhaps a history of anxiety. Maybe a prior depressive episode. The ordinary architecture of a difficult life. What they found instead was a file that had been essentially untouched since Martin's early 20s. No therapist. No psychiatric treatment. No medication. No formal diagnosis of any kind, which was strange. Because the more investigators dug into Martin's past, the more they found evidence of a pattern that, in retrospect, had been present for decades. Former colleagues from a job Martin held in his 30s described him as intensely loyal to a fault. One woman said, "If he decided you mattered to him, that was it. You were everything." It was beautiful in a way, until it was overwhelming. A former neighbor, speaking anonymously, said Martin had once kept a stray cat for 3 weeks after it died before he could bring himself to bury it. He just couldn't do it, the neighbor said. He said it still felt wrong. Like it was too soon, 3 weeks. Now it was 7 days, and it was his mother. And Dr. Okoffer's assessment was becoming something more structured, more clinical, more alarming in its clarity. Martin, she wrote, displayed lifelong patterns consistent with what she called pathological attachment disruption. A condition in which the individual's sense of self becomes so entangled with specific relationships that the ending of those relationships triggers not just grief, but a fundamental dissolution of identity. For Martin, Eleanor wasn't just his mother. She was the architecture of his entire inner world. When she was gone, there was nothing left inside him to tell him what to do. But here's the thing. Here's the part that the news coverage missed entirely. Here's the thing that I couldn't get out of my head when I first went through the case files. Martin had called 911 on the 7th day. Not the 1st. Not the 2nd. Not after a week and a half. The 7th day. And when investigators asked him later, why that night, specifically at 2:13 a.m., Martin gave an answer that stopped everyone in that room cold. Martin said it was her birthday, October the 23rd. Eleanor's 75th birthday. He had woken up that night, the night of her birthday, and for the first time in 7 days, something in him had shifted. He told investigators, "I realized I hadn't wished her happy birthday. I went to the bottom of the stairs, and I stood there. And I knew I couldn't go up. And I knew I couldn't call up to her the way I always had. And that was the moment I understood that it was real. That she was really gone. Not the morning he found her, not the 3 days of air fresheners and closed doors. Her birthday." That was when Martin's mind finally, painfully caught up to reality. And the first thing he did, the very first impulse he followed, was to call for help. Not because he was panicking. Not because he'd been caught. Not because this situation had become unmanageable. Because he finally understood that Eleanor needed to be treated with the dignity that he, in his grief, had accidentally denied her. "She deserved better than what I gave her those 7 days," Martin said. "She deserved someone to tell the world she was gone. And I couldn't be the one to do that while I was still pretending it hadn't happened." The interview room was silent for a very long time after that. Martin was not charged with any criminal offense. The CPS reviewed the case and determined that failure to report Eleanor's death, while not standard conduct, did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution, particularly given the clear medical cause of death and the absence of any evidence of wrongdoing. He was, however, mandated to undergo psychiatric evaluation and a structured course of grief therapy. Dr. Okoffer continued to work with him for over a year. In a follow-up article published in a psychology journal, with Martin's consent, and with identifying details changed, she described his progress as remarkable in its honesty and painstaking in its difficulty. Martin sold 44 Millbrook Lane 6 months after Eleanor's death. He moved to a smaller town. He still works remotely. He attends a grief support group, we're told, on Thursday evenings. The same day Eleanor used to call her friend Patricia from church. And Patricia, Eleanor's friend of 20 years who received the text saying she's a bit under the weather. Did she ever speak to Martin again? She did. She wrote him a letter. And what she said in that letter is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail of this entire story. She wrote, "I knew something was wrong when she missed our call. Eleanor had never missed our call in 14 years. Not once, but I told myself not to interfere. I told myself it wasn't my place. I've spent a long time thinking about what would have happened if I just knocked on that door. She never sent the letter. Her daughter found it in a drawer after Patricia herself passed away. 2 years later, she'd written it. She just never sent it. 2 women, 1 house. 1 phone call that came 7 days too late. And a man sitting at a kitchen table at 2:13 in the morning, finally ready to say out loud what he'd known in his bones for a week. I think there's been a death. There's something about this case that I can't fully shake. And I've been trying to figure out why. I think it's this. Every other crime story, every other mystery has a villain. It has a perpetrator and a victim and a line between them that, no matter how blurred, is still a line. This story doesn't have that. This story has grief. Pure, devastating, utterly human grief. And it asks something genuinely uncomfortable of us. How far are we from Martin, really? Most of us have never faced the loss of someone who was our entire world. But most of us have at some point avoided making a phone call we knew we needed to make. Delayed a conversation. Kept a door closed, literally or otherwise, because opening it meant something was over. Martin just took that impulse. Further than most of us ever will. The psychologists who reviewed his case didn't diagnose him as dangerous. They diagnosed him as human in a way that was, for lack of a better word, extreme. And the question that Dr. Okafor closes her journal article with is one I think is worth ending on tonight. She writes, "We are all, to some extent, the architects of our own realities. Most of us are never truly tested on how solid that architecture is. Martin was. And his response, while deeply unusual, was ultimately motivated by the one thing that connects every case of profound grief I have ever studied. Love. Imperfect, maladaptive, and ultimately painful love. But love nonetheless. Drop a like if this story hit different from what you expected. And genuinely, share it with someone who appreciates stories that aren't easily explained. Because those are the ones worth telling. Before I let you go tonight, I want to tell you one more thing. A detail that wasn't in the news coverage. That wasn't in the psychological case notes. That only came out much later through a source connected to the original investigation. When officers arrived at 44 Millbrook Lane on the night Martin made the call. When they walked into that house and Martin pointed them up the stairs. One of the officers noticed something on the kitchen table as they passed through. 2 cups of tea, both freshly made. Both still steaming. The officer assumed, initially, that Martin had made tea anticipating the police arrival. A gesture of normalcy, an attempt to seem composed. But later, reviewing the timeline, the temperature of the tea, the sequence of events, investigators realized something that didn't quite fit. Martin had made that tea before he called 911, before he picked up the phone, before he decided to end the 7 days of silence. He had made 2 cups of tea, one for himself, one for Eleanor. And then he'd sat there, looking at that second cup, until whatever was left of the wall inside him finally came down, and he dialed. I've been doing this for a long time. I've covered cases that are brutal, cases that are bizarre, cases that are infuriating. This is the first one that genuinely made me sit quietly for a while after I finished reading the files. Because it isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about what happens to a person when the only world they know disappears overnight. And the terrifying thing, the thing I can't stop thinking about, is how many houses, on how many quiet streets have a closed door behind them right now, and nobody knows. Next week, we're covering a case that starts with something far more ordinary than a midnight phone call. It starts with a Google search. A single Google search, made at 11:47 p.m., and it unravels a story that 3 separate law enforcement agencies had been trying and failing to solve for 8 years. The detail that cracked it is so small, so almost invisible, that when I tell you what it is, I promise you, you're going to think about it every time you open a search tab. That one drops next week. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And until then, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe check in on the people you love.